I happen to be the executive director of a nonprofit, the Lansing Art Gallery, and Betty was on our board. So I got to see her every month at the board meetings, and she would drop in and check on us in between and talk a lot about the stories that of her childhood, and she would talk about her travels to Europe. She used to go every year, travel around the world to Poland and Germany. And she was full of stories and advice of retail. So we got to know each other quite well that way. One of the stories that Betty used to tell me was when she was in the fourth grade, she was finally allowed to walk downtown by herself. She lived in Saginaw. Her parents lived in Saginaw, and her uncle owned a retail store. I believe it sold luggage, leather goods and luggage. And soon as she could go downtown by herself, she would run there after school and hang out. She knew from that point on that retail was what she wanted to do as an adult. Her uncle owned the store, and at one point her dad, she used to call him Daddy, Daddy decided to open his own store, and he opened the store in Lansing. So the family moved from Saginaw to Lansing, and Betty stayed there almost until the end of her life. They opened a luggage store on Washington Avenue. Betty got a little area in the basement that was for her to sell gifts. This was after she had gone to college at MSU, and then she had traveled Europe for a couple of years and became very enamored with modernism and the gift shop business. So her dad gave her a table in the basement and told her that if you can sell it, you can buy it. So she started selling things in the basement. She was so successful that her dad bought the store next door, which is now 113 South Washington Square. And they were able to convince George Nelson to come and revamp that building and make it into a modern-looking building. And that became the Lieberman store that most of us know. Sold luggage, really fine leather goods, and gifts. Well, George Nelson worked for Herman Miller, and just the bubble lamp was one of his inventions. The marshmallow sofa was another one. And Betty had read the book, The House, that he wrote, and just fell in love with him. They didn't think he would come and redo the building because he was such a big name, and here they were in Lansing. But he worked in Grand Rapids quite often. So he arranged with them that if they would pay for his airfare to Grand Rapids, he would then travel to Lansing. He stayed with her and her husband when he was doing the renovation. So she got to know him quite well. And the building, the George Nelson redesigned building, became such a pride for her that she felt it was a really work of art and spent her whole life taking care of it and making sure that it was respected and not abused. She had many, many days she would come into the gallery and tell me that she'd gotten an offer to lease the space, but it was a pizza parlor or it was a sandwich shop. And she was adamant that once the building was open for lease, that no one would do anything foodie in there. It had to be something worthy. She used to help us with displays and show us. When we first moved into her space, the gallery, we had jewelry displays that Betty Price had done herself. She spent days and days doing our jewelry displays for us, cutting the boards, covering the boards with fabric, and doing the jewelry displays. You know, Betty used to tell me stories about the secretaries and how the secretaries would come on their lunch hour and look at the purses and the luggage and the other gift items. And one of them would buy something. And then they would take it back to work and show the other secretaries. And then they would all come back and buy one. So I think a lot of people just enjoyed the beauty of it. Even walking by the display windows was an experience. She really treated everyone as if they were a potential buyer, and used to say to me, someone that walks in and leaves with nothing it was because something wasn't done right. She felt that you had to know your product. You had to know the history behind your product. You had to know the artists behind your product. And if you tell the people about the product, they will want it. When we started leasing from Betty, I remember her saying, this is a dream come true. She gave the gallery, which was a nonprofit, an incredible deal because she wanted the space used appropriately. And then when the gallery ended up moving, it sat vacant for quite a while, and it's again a gallery. Well, Betty went to MSU and she met her husband, and then she ended up going, her husband was called to the War Department during World War II, and she had to leave Lansing and go to Washington, D.C. And she talked to me a lot about where she was going to live in Washington, D.C., and how important it was that you live in the right neighborhood. So she said she put on her best suit and gloves, and she went door to door in the neighborhood that she wanted to live in and knocked on the doors and said, I need a space to live. I don't require much. And eventually she found someone that rented her a room. And so she said we had a proper address. She could have stayed in DC, but she really wanted to come back to Lansing. I think that was one of the things about Betty that really intrigued me, was her devotion to Lansing. She went to Europe for a couple of years after college, could have stayed, but came back to Lansing. She went to DC, could have stayed, and chose to come back to Lansing. Lansing was her home.